What are some reasons to believe that the Gospels are reliable?
I think there are a number of reasons to think that the Gospels are generally reliable. Let me just mention two. The first one is that the amount of time between the date of the writings of the Gospels and the events that they record is relatively short for sources in ancient history. To provide a point of comparison, the earliest sources for the life of Alexander the Great come from Arrian and Plutarch, who wrote 400 years or more after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians still consider them to be relatively reliable accounts.
Have no problem with it.
That's right. By contrast, the Gospels and the New Testament letters of Paul date from within the first generation after the events that they record, while eyewitnesses were still alive. Moreover, one of the most interesting developments of contemporary New Testament scholarship is the discovery of sources behind the New Testament on which these New Testament authors rely. Sometimes people will ask, well, are there sources of information about Jesus outside of the New Testament? Now there are, but the most interesting of those sources are not the later ones, they're the earlier ones, the sources on which the New Testament authors themselves rely. And these would include things like the Passion story, the story of Jesus' final week of suffering and death in Jerusalem, which is used by Mark in writing his gospel. This is an incredibly early source, which probably goes back to within the first 10 years after Jesus' life, to the eyewitnesses. Similarly, in Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, in Greece, he quotes from an old tradition which had been given to him and which he handed on to his converts. This tradition relates the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus after his resurrection to various eyewitnesses. And scholars have dated this old tradition to within the first 5 years after Jesus' crucifixion. So the window of opportunity for legend and myth to accumulate is so narrow that compared to other sources of ancient history, the Gospels have a very good claim to be relatively reliable accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus. A.N. Sherwin-White was a Greco-Roman historian, a historian of the era roughly contemporaneous with Jesus. And Sherwin-White says that when you use the writings of an ancient Greek historian like Herodotus to measure the rate at which legend accrues, he says the tests show that even 2 generations is too short a time span to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hard core of historical facts. So, when you turn to the Gospels, the time span was simply too short to allow these legendary tendencies to wipe out the historical core of these stories.